Ethan Caldwell sat in his office, staring at the elegant wedding invitation in his hands. The heavy cardstock, embossed with gold lettering, announced the upcoming nuptials of Sophia Harrington, the woman who had once promised to spend her life with him. Now, she was marrying someone else, and for reasons he couldn't comprehend, she had sent him an invitation. He scoffed, tossing the envelope onto his polished mahogany desk. Was this her way of rubbing her happiness in his face? Did she expect him to attend and offer his blessings, like some well-adjusted, forgiving ex-fiancé? Not a chance. His longtime friend, Michael Carter, picked up the invitation and whistled. "That's cold, Ethan. Are you going?" Ethan let out a dry laugh. "And show up alone? Looking like a man who hasn't moved on? No way." Michael leaned back in the leather chair across from him, considering his words. "Then don't go alone. Show her you've moved on. Take someone stunning, someone who will make her second-guess her choices." Ethan stroked his chin. It wasn't a bad idea. But bringing just anyone wouldn't be enough. He needed to make an impact. Someone who could hold her own, command attention, and leave Sophia wondering who she was. Later that evening, as Ethan left his downtown office, the thought still nagged at him. The streets of New York buzzed with their usual evening chaos, horns blaring, streetlights flickering, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby food cart. Then, he saw her. A young woman sat near the entrance of a small cafe, her knees pulled to her chest, her coat tattered. She wasn't begging, nor did she wear the look of despair he often associated with those who had fallen on hard times. Instead, she sat with a quiet defiance, her gaze fixed on the passing crowd, as if she were watching a world she no longer belonged to but refused to be crushed by. On impulse, he walked toward her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. "Do you need money?" he asked. The woman lifted her head, her piercing green eyes locking onto his. There was no gratitude, no desperate plea, only sharp curiosity. Then, a smirk curved her lips. "What is this? Some social experiment? You ask, and depending on my answer, you either toss me a coin or walk away." Ethan arched a brow. No one spoke to him like that. "Come with me to an event," he said, unbothered. "I'll pay you enough to change your life." She chuckled, shaking her head. "Wow. Do you always talk like some kind of savior, or just when you're trying to sound dramatic?" Ethan felt an unfamiliar amusement tug at him. "Well," he challenged. She stood, brushing dust off her coat, stepping in just close enough for him to catch the faint scent of vanilla. "I accept," she said. "But only because I'm curious." The sleek, black luxury sedan glided smoothly down the busy New York streets, its leather interior silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. Ethan Caldwell sat beside his unexpected companion, stealing quick glances at her as she gazed out the window. She didn't fidget. She didn't ask questions. She didn't even seem curious about where they were going. Most people would have bombarded him with inquiries or at least expressed some excitement at riding in a car that cost more than most homes. But not her. "You don't even want to know where we're headed?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. The woman, Aria Monroe, turned her head slightly, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Someplace expensive, I assume." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And that doesn't interest you?" She tilted her head. Should it? Her indifference intrigued him. Most people in her position would be overwhelmed, but she acted as if none of it mattered. Minutes later, the car pulled up in front of an opulent high-end boutique, the kind of place where personal stylists catered exclusively to Manhattan's elite. Aria stepped out without hesitation, following Ethan through the grand entrance, The scent of expensive perfumes and freshly steamed silk filled the air. A team of stylists rushed to greet them, their eyes flickering to Aria's worn-out coat and scuffed boots before shifting their attention back to Ethan, recognizing his status. "I want a complete transformation," he instructed. "Hair, makeup, wardrobe, everything." The head stylist, a refined woman in a tailored navy suit, nodded eagerly. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell." She turned to Aria with a warm but professional smile. "Right this way." As Aria was led to a private dressing area, she shot Ethan a bemused look. "Still time to change your mind," she teased. Ethan smirked. "Not happening." She disappeared behind a curtain, and for the next 2 hours, Ethan waited. He scrolled through emails, sipped a strong espresso, and glanced at his watch more times than he cared to admit. Then, finally, the head stylist called his name. When he turned toward the entrance of the dressing room, he froze. Aria stood before him, transformed. Gone were the tangled waves of unkempt hair, now, glossy, smooth locks cascaded over her shoulders. The exhaustion that had once dulled her sharp green eyes was replaced with a striking intensity, accentuated by subtle, sophisticated makeup. She wore an elegant navy evening gown, its fabric hugging her frame just enough to hint at confidence rather than vanity. But what stunned him most wasn't her beauty. It was her expression. She wasn't wide-eyed with wonder. She wasn't shocked by the reflection in the mirror. No, she simply observed herself, calm and composed, as if she had seen this version of herself before. Ethan crossed his arms. "You don't look surprised." Aria met his gaze, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Because I'm not." Something inside him shifted. Who was this woman? The evening air was crisp as Ethan Caldwell stepped out of the sleek black sedan, buttoning his tailored jacket. The grand banquet hall shimmered under golden chandeliers, the marble floors reflecting the light like polished glass. Outside, guests in evening gowns and tuxedos gathered, their conversations laced with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Beside him, Aria Monroe emerged with effortless grace, her navy gown flowing around her like liquid silk. From the moment she stepped onto the red carpet, heads turned. Conversations faltered. Eyes widened. Ethan smirked to himself. Perfect. He extended his arm. Without hesitation, Aria slipped her hand into his, her fingers cool and steady against his skin. She wasn't nervous. If anything, she looked as if she belonged here, like she had walked these halls 100 times before. "Follow my lead," Ethan whispered as they stepped into the hall. "Smile. Stay composed. No unnecessary attention." Aria arched a brow. "So, you brought me here to make your ex jealous, and now you want me to be invisible?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. She was right, of course. But he wasn't about to admit it. As they moved through the glittering ballroom, Ethan quickly spotted her, Sophia Harrington. Dressed in an ivory satin gown, she stood at the center of a group, radiant as ever, her laughter perfectly measured, her every move calculated. She hasn't changed, Ethan thought. And then, she saw him. For the briefest moment, her smile faltered. Her eyes flicked to Aria, assessing, calculating. And just like that, the facade returned. "Ethan," Sophia greeted, her tone smooth, practiced. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ethan met her gaze evenly. "Of course, I came." He glanced at Aria. "And I brought company." Sophia's eyes swept over Aria, trying to place her. "We haven't been introduced." Before Ethan could answer, Aria extended her hand, her voice poised. "Aria Monroe." "A pleasure." Sophia hesitated for half a second before taking Aria's hand, her fingers brushing over the delicate diamonds on Aria's borrowed bracelet. "You look familiar," she mused. Aria's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Do I?" A flicker of something, recognition, crossed Sophia's face, but before she could probe further, her fiancé, Henry Whitmore, stepped in. "A toast," he announced, lifting his champagne flute. As glasses clinked and guests turned their attention to the speech, Aria leaned toward Ethan, her voice low and amused. "She's trying to figure out where she knows me from." Ethan chuckled. "And you're enjoying this, aren't you?" Aria lifted her glass with a quiet smirk. "Immensely." As the orchestra struck up a slow waltz, she turned to him, her green eyes alight with something unreadable. "Shall we dance?" Ethan hesitated, then took her hand. Whatever game Aria was playing, he was already too deep to stop now. The warm glow of the ballroom chandeliers reflected in the polished marble floors as Ethan Caldwell guided Aria across the dance floor. His hand rested lightly on her waist, their steps effortless, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. But even as they moved in perfect sync, Ethan's mind raced. She was playing a game he hadn't quite figured out yet. "You did that on purpose," he murmured, leading her through a slow turn. Aria smiled, her green eyes sparkling. "Did what?" He tightened his grip slightly. "You rattled Sophia. And you enjoyed it." She let out a soft laugh. "I told you, I've been in this world before." Ethan's brows furrowed. That was the second time she had hinted at familiarity with high society. But when he had met her, she had been sitting on a street corner, dressed in worn-out clothes. Nothing about her made sense. Before he could press further, a voice interrupted them. "Ethan." He turned to see Michael Blackwood, one of the city's most influential investors, standing nearby with a champagne flute in hand. The older man's sharp gaze flicked to Aria, curiosity evident in his expression. "Quite the entrance tonight," Michael mused. "And quite the company." He extended a hand toward Aria. "Michael Blackwood." Aria took his hand with practiced ease. "Aria Monroe." "A pleasure." Michael studied her, his lips curving into a knowing smirk. "Your face seems familiar." Aria didn't flinch. "Perhaps we've crossed paths before." Ethan observed the exchange, his unease growing. Aria was blending in too well. Too easily. Michael nodded slowly. "Perhaps." He turned to Ethan. "I'll be watching your dance moves, Caldwell. Make sure you don't embarrass yourself." With a chuckle, he moved away, leaving Ethan and Aria alone once more. Ethan pulled her aside, away from the swirling dancers. "Enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "Who are you, really?" Aria sighed, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" "It does when you know things you shouldn't. When you act like you've belonged in this world all along." For a long moment, she simply stared at him. Then, finally, she spoke. "I grew up in a world like yours," she admitted. "Luxury. Power. High society." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Then why were you on the streets?" She exhaled, glancing toward Sophia across the room. "Because my family trusted the wrong person." A realization struck him like a lightning bolt. He stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Who?" Aria's gaze met his, unwavering. "Sophia Harrington," she said. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't just about making Sophia jealous. This was about revenge. Ethan Caldwell sat in his office the next morning, his fingers tapping restlessly against his mahogany desk. The city skyline stretched before him, but his thoughts were miles away, stuck on the revelation from the night before. Aria Monroe. A woman with no records, no history. A woman who had once lived in luxury but had lost everything. And Sophia Harrington was behind it. He had suspected Aria was hiding something, but he hadn't expected this. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to the present. He glanced at the screen, a call from his private investigator. "You found something?" Ethan asked, picking up the call. A low chuckle came through the line. "You were right about her. Aria Monroe doesn't exist. But Isabella Devereaux does." Ethan's breath stilled. "Devereaux?" "The daughter of Richard Devereaux," the investigator confirmed. "A construction magnate who lost everything in a scandal a few years back. It was big, fraud, embezzlement, destroyed contracts. But the evidence against him was shaky. Some say he was framed." Ethan clenched his jaw. "By Sophia." "That's the theory. But by the time anyone could question it, Richard Devereaux had lost everything. He died before he could clear his name." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "So that's why Aria, Isabella, was here. This wasn't about playing games. This was about justice." "Keep digging," he ordered before hanging up. That evening, Ethan found Aria, Isabella, at the boutique hotel where she was staying. He didn't bother knocking, he walked straight in, the weight of what he had learned pressing against his chest. She was seated by the window, staring out at the city lights, a glass of red wine in her hand. "You should lock your door," Ethan said. She didn't turn around. "I knew it was you." He stepped closer, crossing his arms. "Isabella Devereaux." This time, she flinched. "So, you found out," she said, finally facing him. "You let me bring you into Sophia's world knowing exactly who she was," he accused. "You planned this from the start, didn't you?" A slow, bitter smile crossed her lips. "Planned it? No. But when the opportunity came, I took it." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Why didn't you just tell me? Would you have believed me?" She challenged. "Would you have taken my side over hers?" His silence was answer enough. Isabella sighed, setting her glass down. "Sophia ruined my family, Ethan. She framed my father, destroyed everything we had, and walked away without a scratch. I lost my home, my life, my parents." She looked at him, her voice softer now. "I wasn't going to let her get away with it." Ethan studied her, something inside him shifting. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. She smiled sadly. "I always have." Not anymore, Ethan thought. Because if Sophia Harrington had destroyed Isabella's family, then it was time to return the favor. The Harrington Club was a fortress of wealth and power, a place where only the most influential could enter. Tonight, its grand ballroom was alive with the murmur of expensive conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the scent of aged whiskey lingering in the air. Isabella Devereaux stood at the entrance, her black evening gown a striking contrast against the opulent gold-trimmed walls. She had spent years waiting for this moment. Tonight, it would all come to an end. Ethan Caldwell appeared at her side, his presence steady, commanding. He leaned in slightly. "Are you sure about this?" She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the envelope in her hand. "Absolutely." At that moment, Sophia Harrington made her grand entrance. She moved through the crowd like a queen greeting her subjects, her white silk gown shimmering under the chandeliers. But when her gaze met Isabella's, Something flickered behind her carefully crafted mask. "Isabella," Sophia said, her voice smooth but sharp. "You accepted my invitation." "How bold." Isabella smiled, stepping closer. "I couldn't resist." Sophia's lips curled upward, but her eyes remained cold. "I suppose you've enjoyed the attention lately. Quite the story in the papers, isn't it?" Isabella let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, I'm used to being the center of attention. Something I believe you've always wanted for yourself." A flicker of irritation crossed Sophia's face before she regained control. "You lost, darling. No matter what you try, you'll never reclaim what you had." Isabella tilted her head, amused. "Funny," she murmured. "I was about to say the same to you." Before Sophia could react, Ethan stepped forward, holding out an envelope. "Sophia," he said, his voice as smooth as polished steel, "it looks like you didn't read the papers today." Sophia hesitated, then took the envelope with an elegant but wary hand. As she unfolded the documents inside, her expression changed. The blood drained from her face. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, gripping the papers tighter. "Evidence," Ethan said. "Bank statements, recorded calls, contracts, all proving your involvement in the fraud that destroyed the Devereaux family." "It's over, Sophia." Gasps rippled through the crowd as whispers spread like wildfire. Sophia Harrington, the untouchable queen of high society, had been exposed. She clutched the papers, her breath coming faster. "You can't do this to me." Isabella leaned in, her voice low and final. "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself." Before Sophia could respond, the grand doors burst open. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. "Sophia Harrington," one of them announced. "You are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and market manipulation." Sophia's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in her life, she had no words. As the officers cuffed her wrists, she turned to Ethan, desperation in her eyes. "Say something." He looked at her, utterly indifferent. "Your only mistake was thinking you'd never get caught." As Sophia was led away, Isabella exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in years, she felt free. Ethan turned to her, his voice soft. "It's over." She met his gaze, her heart steady for the first time in a long time. "No," she said, a small smile forming. "It's just beginning." The morning after Sophia Harrington's arrest, the headlines were everywhere. High society heiress exposed in financial scandal, arrest shakes elite circles. The fall of Sophia Harrington, fraud, lies, and justice served. Ethan Caldwell sat in his penthouse, sipping his black coffee as he scanned the news. He had expected backlash, but instead, the world had turned against Sophia. Investors were pulling out, her business empire was crumbling, and her once loyal allies were distancing themselves. Across the room, Isabella Devereaux stood by the window, her arms crossed as she gazed out over the city. The woman who had once lived in the shadows was now at the center of a story that had captured the public's attention. "You did it," Ethan said, setting his mug down. She turned, her green eyes steady. "We did it." He smirked. "You sure you don't want to take all the credit? You played the game better than anyone." A small smile touched her lips. "I didn't do this for revenge, Ethan. I did it to clear my father's name. And now, for the first time in years, I can breathe." She exhaled, as if to prove her point, and walked over to sit across from him. He studied her carefully, noting the way she carried herself now, lighter, freer. but there was still something unreadable in her expression. "So, what now?" he asked. Isabella reached for a small envelope on the table and slid it toward him. "What's this?" "My next step," she said simply. Ethan opened it, scanning the crisp letter inside. His brows lifted. "You're starting a company?" She nodded. "Devereaux Consulting. A strategic investment and financial analysis firm. I've spent years surviving, Ethan. Now, I want to build something." He leaned back, impressed. "And you're doing it on your own?" "Not exactly." She met his gaze, cautious but determined. "I'm looking for a business partner." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You want me to invest?" She smirked. "You always said you never pass up a good opportunity." He set the letter down and studied her for a long moment. "You could have walked away from all of this, Isabella. Started fresh somewhere else. But you're staying." Her smile softened. "I have unfinished business. And besides," she tilted her head, her voice teasing, "New York wouldn't be nearly as fun without you in it." Ethan's chest tightened at her words, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he picked up his coffee and took a slow sip, masking his grin. "Well, Miss Devereaux," he said, his tone light but serious. "If we're going into business together, I should warn you, I'm not easy to work with." She laughed, shaking her head. "Neither am I." For the first time in a long time, they weren't chasing ghosts. They were building something real. Together. Weeks passed, and Devereaux Consulting was already making waves in the industry. Isabella had thrown herself into the work, securing investors, meeting with potential clients, and proving that she was more than just a woman with a scandalous past. She was a force to be reckoned with. Ethan Caldwell, ever the businessman, had stood by her side. But not as a silent investor. He challenged her, pushed her, and made sure that every decision she made was one she could defend. And yet, despite their constant debates over strategy and market trends, there was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them dared to confront. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Isabella sat in her office, rubbing her temples. The glow of the city lights reflected off the glass walls, casting a golden hue over the room. She was exhausted but satisfied. The door opened without a knock. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Ethan," she sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Ever heard of knocking?" "I own half the company," he reminded her with a smirk. "That gives me certain privileges." She chuckled, shaking her head. "What do you want?" He stepped closer, setting a cup of coffee in front of her. "You look like you could use this." She eyed it warily. "Is this a bribe?" "Consider it an investment," he said, sitting across from her. "Keeping my partner from burning out is in my best interest." Isabella wrapped her hands around the warm mug, inhaling the rich aroma. "You always think in terms of business, don't you?" Ethan studied her for a moment. "Not always." Something about his tone made her look up. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. There it was, that unspoken tension, the lingering glances, the quiet understanding that had been growing between them since the night they met. She swallowed hard. "Ethan. I love you, Isabella." The words were simple, direct, exactly the way he did everything in life. Her breath caught in her throat. She had spent so long running, so long convincing herself that love was a distraction, a weakness she couldn't afford. But here, now, with Ethan looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered, she couldn't deny what she had known for months. "I love you too," she admitted softly. A slow smile spread across his face. Finally. She laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. And yet, you love me anyway. Before she could argue, he leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't hurried or desperate, it was certain, steady, like everything between them had led to this moment. When they finally pulled apart, Isabella exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. What now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan grinned. Now we stop pretending we can live without each other. And just like that, the game they had been playing was over. They had both won. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Isabella had ever known. She had spent years fighting to survive, to prove herself, to reclaim her life. But now, for the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And Ethan was at the center of it all. Their relationship didn't change the way they worked. They still argued over business strategies, still pushed each other to be better, still competed like neither would ever back down. But now, there were stolen kisses between meetings, quiet dinners after long days, and mornings where Ethan made sure Isabella never left for the office without a cup of coffee waiting on her desk. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ethan drove them out of the city. He didn't say where they were going, only that she needed to trust him. When they arrived at a secluded beach house overlooking the ocean, Isabella was speechless. She stood on the back porch, feeling the salty breeze on her skin as the waves crashed against the shore. Why did you bring me here? She asked, turning to Ethan. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Her heart stopped. I once thought love was a distraction, he admitted. Something that would make me weak. But you made me stronger. You challenged me, you changed me, and now, I can't imagine a life without you. He dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring. Isabella Devereaux, he said, his voice steady. Will you marry me? For the first time in a long time, Isabella didn't hesitate. Yes, she whispered, emotion thick in her voice. 1,000 times, yes. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms. The waves crashed, the stars shimmered above them, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Their journey had been anything but ordinary, filled with deception, revenge, and unexpected love. But as Ethan held Isabella close, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Life has a way of leading us down unexpected paths, often through struggles that test our strength and resilience. Isabella and Ethan's journey teaches us that even in our darkest moments, redemption and love are possible. One of the greatest lessons from their story is that true strength comes from perseverance. Isabella lost everything but refused to be defeated. Instead of letting betrayal define her, she rebuilt her life with determination. Her story reminds us that setbacks are not the end, they are the foundation for new beginnings. Another powerful message is that love isn't about control or convenience, it's about finding someone who challenges us to be better. Ethan, a man once driven by power, learned that vulnerability is not a weakness but a sign of real strength. In opening his heart, he found something more valuable than wealth, a partner who truly understood him. For those who have faced loss, disappointment, or unexpected turns in life, this story is a reminder that second chances exist, not just in love, but in the opportunity to rebuild, to grow, and to embrace happiness once more.